The sound of roaring engines broke the stillness of the empty highway, the asphalt stretching endlessly beneath the fading golden hues of the setting sun. It was a night that would change everything. The kind of night that leaves scars, both on the land and in the soul. Beneath the thrum of motorcycle engines, a lone figure stood, a German shepherd named Thor, his fur matted with dirt and blood. His body trembled with exhaustion, but his eyes remained sharp and focused, piercing through the chaos around him. The sound of jeering bikers filled the air, their harsh laughter like a slap to the face. They were used to terrorizing, to playing God in their corner of the world, but they didn't know this dog. Thor was no ordinary canine. He had been trained for this. His body, battered and bruised, was the physical testament to a life lived on the edge, but his spirit remained unbroken. Every part of him screamed with pain, but the instincts he had honed for years were still intact. Harrow, his handler, crouched in the shadows, watching the scene unfold with bated breath. A former military veteran turned federal agent, Hank had seen his share of danger, but tonight, something was different. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched his loyal partner surrounded by the notorious Steel Serpent Gang. His partner, his family, stood alone in the face of adversity. "You ready, Thor?" Hank whispered under his breath, the words barely audible in the darkness. Thor's ears perked up in acknowledgement. They had been through worse together, and this night wouldn't be the one that broke them. The gang, drunk on power and hatred, didn't realize the true danger they were facing. One of them, a burly man with a snake tattoo creeping up his neck, stepped forward, chain in hand, swinging it menacingly at the dog. Thor growled, low and defiant, his teeth gleaming under the dimming light. The bikers' laughter only grew louder, unaware that their mocking would soon be turned into terror. Hank's fingers tightened on the grip of his weapon, but he knew better than to rush in. Every move had to be calculated. Every step had to be perfect. Rushing in blindly would only risk Thor's life, and that was a risk Hank was unwilling to take. The moments stretched on like hours, and Hank could feel his blood boiling. He had lost so much, his family, his peace, his sense of purpose, but Thor had been the one constant in his life. Together, they had fought through the darkest days of their past. Tonight, it was no different. Thor wasn't just his partner. He was the only family Hank had left. Welcome to the HeartForce channel, where you and I find more meaning in life through stories about dogs. Before we continue, please comment below and let us know where you're listening to this video from. And if you have any stories about your dog, feel free to share them with everyone. The biker with the snake tattoo swung his chain, a cruel glint in his eyes. But before it could connect with Thor, a sudden movement from Hank interrupted the scene. With the precision of a seasoned soldier, Hank took a calculated risk. He moved into position, his fingers sliding across his weapon as if guided by an invisible hand. His breath was steady, calm, an emotionless exterior masking the rage boiling beneath. "Now, Thor," Hank barked, his voice low but firm. With a fierce snarl, Thor launched himself into action, his body a blur of muscle and instinct. The biker swung the chain with a wide arc, but Thor was faster, dodging the attack and charging at the man with a brutal force. The gang froze for a moment, their arrogance slipping as they realized that this was no ordinary dog. They had awoken something much more dangerous than they could have imagined. The battle was over before it even began. Thor brought the biker to the ground, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's arm, rendering him helpless. The other gang members hesitated, unsure whether to fight or flee. In that fleeting moment of hesitation, Hank moved swiftly and without mercy, his training guiding his every movement. He was not here to play games. The bikers were no longer laughing. The situation had flipped. This wasn't a random K9 unit, and this wasn't a routine takedown. This was a personal vendetta, one that Hank had been carrying for years. As Thor pinned the injured man to the ground, Hank's thoughts raced back to a time when family was everything. He had grown up in the shadow of a man who was as dedicated to his job as he was to his family, a man who had served his country with honor and integrity. His father, William Harrow, had been a special operative, a legend in the world of military K9s. But it wasn't just Hank who had paid the price of that legacy. His entire family had. Hank's memories of his father's training were bittersweet. He remembered long days in the field, lessons in loyalty and protection. He remembered watching his father's stern face soften when he spoke about family, about legacy. But he also remembered the day everything had changed. It had been years ago, on a quiet evening in their Montana home, when Hank's world had crumbled. His brother, Ryan, had been taken away after the family's painful divorce, leaving Hank alone with his father. The loss of his brother left a hole in Hank's heart that would never fully heal. They had been inseparable until the day Ryan had been ripped from their lives. Hank had seen the effect it had on his father, the silent anguish that weighed him down. William had never spoken of it, but Hank knew the pain was there. William Harrow had always been a man of action, of focus, but that focus had come at a cost. By the time Hank had joined the military K9 unit, the loss of his family had become a distant memory, one that had been buried under years of service and training. But the scars remained. And now, as Hank watched Thor take down the biker with an effortless strength, he realized that family wasn't something you could easily walk away from. The case they were working on, this weapons trafficking operation involving the Steel Serpents, had more personal ties than Hank had realized. There was something about this operation, something that felt like déjà vu. The pieces of his father's last mission were falling into place, and Hank was finally beginning to understand why everything had happened the way it had. The man on the ground, now struggling beneath Thor's relentless grip, had been part of a much larger operation than any of them could have imagined. A wave of realization washed over Hank as the truth began to take shape. He wasn't just facing down a group of criminals. He was facing the very same shadows that had taken his father's life. As the last of the bikers fled, their retreating engines echoing through the Montana wilderness, Hank stood motionless. His thoughts were far from the present. They were on a past long buried, on a family he thought he had lost forever. But tonight, standing here, in this quiet moment with his partner Thor, Hank felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. They weren't just fighting for justice. They were fighting for the truth, for the memory of a father who had sacrificed everything, and for a family that, despite everything, had never truly been broken. Through the quiet Montana night, his mind racing. The encounter with the Steel Serpents was only the beginning. Hank felt the weight of the night's events, like a shadow pressing against his chest, heavy and suffocating. He glanced at Thor, whose eyes were alert despite the exhaustion in his body, and thought about what had brought them here, the unfinished business tied to his father's death. Hank's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was a text from his old contact in the FBI, Sarah Harrow, the mother he never knew he needed until now. "You need to come to the clinic. It's time we talk about your father." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His father, William Harrow, the man who had been more than just a father. He was a legend. And now, years after his death, Hank was finding himself piecing together a puzzle he never thought he'd need to solve. But he had to. There was no other choice. His father's death, his legacy, his family's legacy, it all came crashing back. He swerved the truck onto a dirt road leading to a small clinic on the outskirts of town. The building was quiet, the lights dim. A single car parked outside. Hank parked and stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel. He felt Thor's eyes on him, unblinking, as if the dog too sensed the importance of what was about to unfold. Inside, the clinic was sterile and cold, the smell of antiseptic hanging in the air. Sarah was waiting for him, her face hard and unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of sadness, of knowing more than she let on. "You're here," she said, her voice steady but heavy with unspoken history. "What's going on?" Hank asked, his voice low. He had learned long ago that Sarah didn't deal in half-truths, but he had no idea what to expect now. Sarah didn't waste time. "I've been going through some things," she said, pulling a file from a drawer. "Your father wasn't just working on weapons trafficking cases. He was onto something much bigger. Something that—" She stopped, letting the words hang in the air like a challenge. Hank's heart began to pound as she opened the file, revealing pictures, names, and documents. He didn't need to read them to understand. The steel serpents were only a small part of the puzzle. This was about corruption at the highest levels, people Hank had known, respected, and trusted. And somewhere in all of this was the betrayal of blood, a betrayal Hank had never suspected. Thompson, Hank muttered, the name slipping from his lips like venom. He's not just a criminal. He's connected to something else, something deeper. Sarah nodded. Your father figured it out. He found evidence of a covert operation called Project Guardian, a network of blackmail, military intelligence, people in positions of power who had been compromised. The pieces began to fall into place. It wasn't just about the gang. It was about the people Hank had trusted, the ones he had worked alongside. They had all been part of the game, one that wasn't about loyalty, honor, or country. It had been about power. What does this have to do with me? Hank asked, the weight of it all settling in. Sarah's gaze softened. It has everything to do with you. Your father left you something that he knew would bring you here to this moment. She slid a small, weathered envelope across the table, its corners frayed with age. Hank hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside was a letter from his father, dated just days before his death. Hank, if you're reading this, then things have gone terribly wrong. I'm sorry, but you need to know the truth. Project Guardian isn't about weapons or deals. It's about control. The people we're up against have been hiding in plain sight, and I know they will come for you next. Trust Thor. He's more than just a dog. He's been trained for this moment. Just like you. Together, you'll finish what I've started. I need you to protect this family, to protect the truth. Don't trust anyone, not even me. Your father. Hank's hands shook as he read the letter. This was bigger than he had ever imagined. His father's death wasn't an accident. It had been a sacrifice, a final act of protection, one that Hank had been blind to until now. The pieces of the past, his father's cryptic words, the strange circumstances surrounding his death, the way he had distanced himself from Hank's mother, were all starting to make sense. It's all connected, Hank said, his voice rough. The steel serpents, Thompson. Project Guardian. This is what my father died protecting. Sarah gave him a long, quiet look. Your father wasn't just trying to stop them. He was trying to buy you time, to give you a chance to find the truth and bring it to light. Hank clenched his jaw. He had been fighting for so long, running after shadows, chasing ghosts. But now, the truth was within his reach, and he wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers. This isn't over, Hank said, determination settling in his chest. I'm going after Thompson. I'm going to bring down everyone involved in this. Sarah stood up. And I'm with you. But remember, Hank, this isn't just about justice. It's about family. The truth your father protected. The truth he believed in. It's bigger than all of us. Hank nodded, glancing down at Thor, who sat loyally by his side. Together, they had faced the unthinkable. And now, they were about to face the truth, no matter the cost. The morning fog was thick, curling around the trees like a shroud. It was the perfect cover for a plan that had been years in the making. Hank stood at the edge of the forest, his posture stiff but alert. His fur had finally begun to heal from the wounds of the previous battle, but his eyes were sharper than ever. Beside him, Hank's handler, Hank Harrow, stood with the weight of the world on his shoulders. The family he had thought lost forever was now standing together, and the truth about his father's death was within reach. The operation wasn't going to be easy. They had already tracked the steel serpents to their hideout, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. But the gang wasn't their only target. It was what lay behind the gang, the real power that Hank was after. This was a confrontation with the past, the truth that his father had died protecting. It was time to bring that truth to light, no matter the cost. Thor, Hank muttered, reaching down to pet the dog's head. We're in this together. Thor's ears twitched, his body stiffening as if sensing the gravity of the moment. He was more than just a partner. He was the last remaining connection to a family lost to secrets and betrayal. Hank had known the dog was special from the first moment they had met. He had been his father's final legacy, the protector of a family torn apart by lies. We've got company, Sarah Harrow's voice crackled through Hank's radio, pulling him from his thoughts. I've got a visual on Thompson's men moving toward the warehouse. But this isn't just about a gang anymore, Hank. You're about to face the men who killed your father. Hank's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he adjusted his grip on his weapon. His father's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes loyalty comes from unexpected places. Hank had seen that loyalty in Thor, and he had seen it in his brother, Ryan. It was what had kept them all alive, what had kept them fighting. But tonight, the stakes were higher than ever. They moved through the trees, shadows in the early morning light, until the warehouse came into view. The steel walls loomed like a tomb, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. Hank could feel the memories flooding back, the echoes of his father's last mission, the way he had prepared them for this fight without them even knowing it. The steel serpents, once a band of criminals operating in the shadows, were now part of something much bigger. The real power behind them was Project Guardian, a covert operation designed to manipulate the highest levels of government, military, and law enforcement. These weren't just criminals. They were the men who had infiltrated the very institutions that were supposed to protect the people. Stay low, stay quiet. Hank whispered to Thor as they crouched behind a stack of crates. The dog's ears were up, his senses tuned to the environment around them. Every footstep, every breath, every shift in the air was a clue. Then they saw him, Director Thompson, the man responsible for everything. The man who had manipulated Hank's father, who had used him for his own gain, and who had now made Hank the target of his twisted game. Thompson stood at the entrance of the warehouse, barking orders to his men. He had no idea that Hank Harrow was closing in, or that this would be the last fight of his life. I've waited a long time for this, Hank muttered under his breath. The first shot came from the trees. Hank fired with precision, taking down one of Thompson's men before they could react. The remaining guards scrambled, but Hank and Thor moved like a well-oiled machine. They knew each other better than anyone else ever could. They anticipated each other's moves, communicated with a glance, with a shift of position. Hank was relentless, his training kicking in, but there was something more, something that went beyond the battlefield. This was personal. The sound of gunfire echoed through the air as the warehouse doors slammed shut. Hank and Thor were inside. The final confrontation had begun. Thompson, Hank called, his voice cutting through the chaos. It's time to face the truth. Thompson turned slowly, his eyes cold and calculating. The man was everything Hank had come to hate. A man who had sold his soul for power, for control, for the illusion of safety. But Hank knew better. No one was safe in the world Thompson had built. Not even him. You think you can take me down, Harrow? Thompson sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. You're just a man with a dog. What's that going to do against the empire I've built? You're wrong, Hank said, his voice steady. You've been hiding behind lies for too long. But it's over now. The next few moments were a blur. Bullets flew, and the sound of violence filled the air. Hank's heart pounded, but his mind was clear. He had a job to do, and he was going to finish it. The fight with Thompson's men was fierce, but Hank and Thor were faster, stronger, and more determined than anyone could have predicted. They were a team, one forged in loyalty, in sacrifice, in love. Finally, Hank reached Thompson. The man stood alone, his back against the wall, eyes wide with fear. He had been backed into a corner, and for the first time in his life, he knew he wasn't going to win. Not tonight. You'll never understand, Thompson spat, but his words faltered as Hank stepped closer, the barrel of his gun aimed directly at his chest. Hank's voice was cold, final. No, you'll never understand. Loyalty, honor, family, these are things you'll never have. And now, you'll face the consequences. Thompson opened his mouth to say something, but the sound of approaching helicopters interrupted him. Hank glanced up, seeing the flash of headlights cutting through the darkness. The cavalry was finally here. But Thompson's time was up. It was over. With one final pull of the trigger, Hank ended it. The man who had spent his life in the shadows, hiding behind corruption and deceit, was no longer a threat. The truth was out. Hank and Thor had won. As the helicopters descended, Hank allowed himself a moment of peace. The fight was over, but the battle for his family's legacy had just begun. The sun was rising slowly over the mountains, casting a soft, golden light across the quiet Montana landscape. The world seemed peaceful for the first time in a long time, as if the storms of the past had finally passed. But for Hank Harrow, the work was far from over. The battle had been won, but the true mission, what his father had entrusted him with, was still unfolding. He sat on the porch of the old family cabin, Thor at his side, as his brother Ryan approached, a solemn expression on his face. The wounds from their final confrontation with Thompson were still fresh, but Hank could see the healing beginning. Not just in his body, but in his heart. They had faced their demons together, and now it was time to rebuild, to honor the legacy of their father. "Think he would have been proud of us?" Ryan asked, his voice low as he sat down next to Hank. Hank looked at his brother, his gaze softening. For years, he had resented Ryan, blaming him for the pain of their separation. But now, in this moment, he realized how much they needed each other. They weren't just brothers. They were survivors, both of them shaped by the same harsh lessons of loyalty, sacrifice, and love. "I think he would have been proud," Hank said quietly, reaching down to pet Thor, who was still recovering from the battle. "We did what he wanted. We found the truth. We brought the family back together." Ryan nodded, his eyes distant. "We couldn't have done it without you, Hank. Without Thor. Without Dad's legacy." The two men sat in silence for a while, the weight of their father's sacrifices settling between them. Hank had always thought that his father's death was a tragedy, but now he understood. William Harrow had known what he was doing. He had prepared them for this moment, even if it meant they would have to walk separate paths before they could finally come back together. "You know," Ryan said, breaking the silence, "I always thought Dad had abandoned us. But now, I think he did what he had to do to protect us, to make sure we'd be strong enough to fight this battle when the time came." Hank glanced at his brother, a sense of understanding settling in his chest. Yeah, he knew the truth would come out eventually, and when it did, we'd be ready. They both turned their attention to Thor, who was lying on the porch, his head resting on his paws. The dog's eyes were calm, almost wise, as if he knew the significance of the moment. He had been more than just a partner to Hank. He had been a symbol of everything they had fought for. Family, loyalty, love. Thor had carried their legacy, and now it was time to pass it on. "We still got work to do," Hank said, standing up and stretching. "The fight's not over. There are more people out there who need to be held accountable for what they've done." Ryan stood beside him, nodding. "But we're not alone anymore, Hank. We got each other, and we've got Thor." Hank smiled, feeling the weight of his father's final words settle in his heart. Family isn't just about blood. It's about who stands with you when everything else falls apart. Hank had never truly understood what that meant until now. And we're not done yet, but we're ready. The days that followed were filled with quiet moments of reflection as the family slowly began to rebuild. They had lost so much. Hank stood by the window, looking out at the mountains in the distance, the same mountains his father had once taught him to navigate. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a man who had learned the true meaning of loyalty, of family. He had learned that the greatest victories weren't the ones won in battle. They were the ones fought in the heart. In the moments when everything seemed lost, but you found the strength to keep going. Thor walked up to him, his tail wagging slowly, as if understanding the significance of the moment. Hank knelt down and scratched behind his ears, a smile tugging at his lips. "You did it, boy," Hank whispered. "You kept the family safe. You kept me safe." Thor's eyes met his, filled with that unwavering loyalty that had kept them alive through so much. It wasn't just training. It was love, a love that had been passed down through generations, a love that would never fade. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Hank stood tall, his family by his side. There was still work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, Hank felt at peace. He had his brother back. He had his partner back. And together, they would continue to fight for what was right, for what their father had died protecting. Because the truth wasn't in the files. It wasn't in the evidence. The truth was in the choices they made. It was in the actions they took. And Hank knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. The beginning of a new chapter for the Harrow family. A chapter built on love, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog. The road ahead would be long. There would be battles to fight, enemies to face, and sacrifices to be made. But one thing was certain. No matter what happened, Hank knew they would face it together. As a family. This story has reminded us that the true power of family isn't found in the absence of struggle, but in the way we rise to meet it. Sometimes, the pain we face is part of a bigger plan, shaping us into the people we are meant to be. In the end, it is love, loyalty, and the bonds we share that define us, not the hardships we've endured. What did you think of Hank's journey and the powerful bond he shared with Thor? Can you relate to the themes of family, loyalty, and sacrifice? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the HeartForce channel for more heartwarming and inspiring stories.